we've seen some big projects be let, so money being put out there of how much is going to be spent on it, and people, bidding on that. But broadly speaking, a lot of that is still working through the process, I guess.
Yeah.
And so most people expect that we'll start seeing a lot more of it end of this year, going into next year. And I mean, it's going to be, I think, a somewhat maybe midterm sustained consumption point, because it like some of these projects are going to take years
Yeah,
to
fair enough.
and it's gonna probably be more impactful on the plate side. You think bridges, they need thicker material, longer lasting material.
Mhm.
Um, and so the plate side, and also long products, so rebar, because it'll be going into concrete roads and all that stuff.
Greg Sheldon here, your host of Metal, Steel, Manufacturing, and Business Pro podcast, where you learn everything about the metals and manufacturing industry that make your modern day life possible. All right. Welcome, everybody. Greg Sheldon here, as you know. Today we have Rye Druzin. Rye is an associated editor covering flat and tubular steel pricing and news in the U.S. from Argus Media from its Houston office. Since September 2022, he has also been responsible for OCTG and line pipe pricing and news. Before Argus, Rye was an energy reporter from 2014 to 2019, covering the Texas oil and gas industry in the Permian Basin and Eagle Ford shale plays. He also reported on statewide utility power issues related to the adoption of solar and wind, phasing out of coal, and San Antonio CPS Energy, one of the largest municipally owned utilities in the United States. He's a native Californian. Rye earned his Bachelor of Arts in Internal Affairs from Lewis and Clark College in 2013, and he's a backpacker, a biker, a baker, and a beer drinker. So that's awesome, man. What a great all the important things. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Greg.
Yeah, you're welcome, man. It's my honor. There's lots to learn from you. I know that. So tell us about yourself, sir. What got you to become a journalist?
Sure. Well, I think part of that is I'm the youngest of three. So I have two older brothers. And actually, at one point, all three of us were journalists, I think around the same time. And so I kind of have that inspiration from my brothers. I'm also a very curious person. So I really liked knowing stuff and learning things and experiencing different and new industries or experiences. So I actually did some other journalism before coming to Texas. Did a little short stint in Israel. Did some reporting in my hometown after college as well. But then, like many other people, you kind of put out a lot of different feelers, trying to find a job. Maybe in my case, it was a couple hundred. And in 2014, a newspaper out in Midland, Texas, which I had never heard about, reached out and hired me on as business reporter. And what I didn't realize is that out in a place like Midland, business is oil and gas. No matter if you're a barbecue joint, trash pickup, or directly related to the oil and gas industry, it is all energy. So, I drove out to far west Texas, or I guess West Texas. Far west is a little further, into the middle of the oil patch in a Prius with California plates. So to say I stood out is a little bit of an understatement.
Yeah.
But the people were nice, hardworking. I got there in August 2014. So anyone who knows the oil and gas industry will remember that just a few months after that, in November, it was probably one of the worst Thanksgivings for the oil and gas industry in recent memory, because OPEC, the global petroleum cartel, decided that time to continue to pump oil rather than cut production, which meant that prices proceeded to fall pretty quickly. So I got into Midland around the time when the oil boom was ending, and then I was there for the downturn to begin, which was a real interesting time. So
Yeah, yeah, it would have been definitely. Well, oil and gas still remains to be interesting, in my
yeah,
opinion. It's doing a lot of crazy things. I remember through COVID, the fuel was so low. It reminded me when I first got my license. It was so low,
right.
It's
Yeah.
like party like it's 1999, right?
Well, it's funny you say that because I remember, after I was in Midland, I moved to Victoria, Texas, which is in South Texas. And so out in West Texas and Midland, you have the Permian Basin, which really is the king of oil fields in the lower 48 at least. And then in South Texas, you have the Eagle Ford Shale, which is another oil and gas play that is much trickier. It's just a different geology. I think it's more technical overall. Petroleum engineers don't at me. I don't really understand the differences between the plays, but that was my impression at least. And when I was out there, I remember a town that I covered, Cuero. I got gas for $1.15 a gallon, and filling up a Prius meant less than $10. So it was quite something because I'm also from California, the land of expensive gas. So
Yeah,
um, yeah, no, but you make a good point. Oil and gas. I sit here in Houston, the energy capital of the world, and in an office where we do oil and gas all the time. And there was a point at the beginning of the pandemic where prices went negative, and that was,
crazy.
I mean, it was insane. Yeah, I mean the market blew up just like many other parts of the economy in that moment.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're still seeing things from it, right? Um,
Yeah, there's
I'm,
still impacts for sure.
I'm curious about um your Prius. Do you still have the Prius?
So, no, I do miss its gas mileage. It was a good little loyal car. Unfortunately, I did total it driving back from Austin to San Antonio when I lived in San Antonio.
Oh no.
Yeah, I mean, I was fine. The people who I hit were fine.
Good.
And I ended up actually buying a Subaru, which turned out not to be the greatest car. And after that one, I bit the bullet, or maybe got bit by the bug, because I had always wanted a pickup truck. Uh,
Did you
so I
put
bought,
big rims on it and tires
yeah,
and
right.
stuff?
So I bought a Toyota Tacoma, which I still have today. Very loyal,
Yeah, great
uh,
truck.
good truck. Yeah,
Yeah.
but I'm a Toyota guy, I guess.
Yeah.
So
The taco. The
yeah,
taco. Yeah, yeah. No, there you can't go wrong with a Toyota. I agree.
except for
Um,
the gas mileage, the truck is. Oof,
yeah, yeah,
it's
yeah.
not a Prius.
Oh man. Well, that's cool. Did you put a breather on it? Like, do you go
Uh,
off-roading and stuff?
so I mean, I did some upgrade shocks and stuff, but it looks from the outside pretty stock because I'm not.
Yeah. That's the kind of guy I am too. It's like I'm the guy that would have the sleeper. It's like we pull up to the stoplight and my car looks like shit. But when I punch it,
Yeah,
look out. Anyway,
yeah.
enough about cars. I'm curious about the transition and your journalism experience, like going to business. Like, how was that for you? Like the learning business. Did you already have a kind of a keen sense of business or
No, really, I didn't. And I mean, I think that is probably the way that a lot of people who cover business end up. I mean, I went into journalism wanting to do international reporting. I wanted to go abroad. I'm not gonna lie, I was inspired a lot by my oldest brother. He was a war correspondent for a time, and so there was a long time where I that's what I wanted to do. I actively pursued that as well, but falling into business was definitely not an intention, but it has been hugely rewarding and interesting because that the nexus of everything in our world is people having to buy and sell things. And so through the work that I got to do, and I still do, I got to um, gain an understanding of how it works, also dig into the information that's available to try to figure out what is happening in the moment, and also go see some really, really cool stuff, whether it was climbing a 200 plus foot tall wind turbine out in West Texas, or going to the Toyota truck plant in San Antonio, or, going to a steel mill. Uh, it, the line of work that I've been lucky to fall into has just afforded me a lot of unique and awesome opportunities to get to understand, like, there's a nexus between, people make business. I don't think business makes people, because at the end of the day, you need people there. And so to get to interact with the people who make it all work has been really, really cool.
Yeah, man, that's absolutely 100% my experience too. It's all about people.
Yeah.
The businesses are just kind of an extension of us, right? It's
Right.
just, your core values and is represented through the business.
Yeah.
Well, how has it been? Like, building a network is hard and it's a talent. I mean, how's that been? The whole building of the network and building trust with people. How's that gone?
Yeah. Well, I think what was interesting is when I worked at newspapers, it was a very different proposition because you had a beat to cover. News stories would come across your desk, but you'd also have to go and kind of think differently about what's going on. You didn't necessarily have like a list of companies who you covered, because like in San Antonio, it was like huge amount of potential people there. But you in that way you would, you're networking with the companies, you're networking with activists who maybe are pushing back against what companies are doing. I actively was like driving out to places like Portland, Texas, which is north of Corpus Christi on the coast, to sit in on meetings where the local community was basically protesting a huge, what's called an ethane cracker. Basically, a facility that takes natural gas and, this is very basic explanation, but then produces plastics. That's how you make plastics. And they didn't want it because it was within a couple miles of their high school, right? And so a lot of that was much more like on the ground, um, uh, creating source development on the ground in person, having to really be out there for time, and spending time with people. And when it comes to what we do at Argus, believe me, interpersonal relationships are huge. I mean, there's nothing that's going to ever replace having a beer, having a coffee. What I did literally an hour and a half ago, getting lunch with some sources who I'd never met before on the pipe side. And so that's a big part of it for sure. I think what's interesting with the PRA space, which was actually really hard for me as a newspaper reporter to do, is that with price reporting agencies, we talk to sources all the time, and ask them for information about what they're buying or selling steel for, what their inventories are looking like, how their business is looking like, all this stuff. But they have no reason to necessarily talk to us. And one of the things that makes it valuable to talk to us is the fact that we're talking to a lot of their competitors and other people in the industry. And we trade, we talk to them and we are like, yeah, well, hey, this is what we're hearing. And I mean, we're not telling them we talk to whoever at whatever company, but it's like, hey, like, I know you have stuff that's really interesting and valuable to me, and I have stuff that's interesting and valuable to you. And at a certain point, you don't even realize it, but you become an expert. But I don't look at it as I know more or I'm better than anyone else. I've only been doing this for 4 years, and the people who I'm talking to have been doing it for a decade or 20 or 30 or 40 plus years.
Mm-hmm.
And I think part of it with source building, you have to be humble. I mean, you really do. And I'm not just saying that because it's like a
No, I agree.
catchy phrase, but
Yeah.
you can't assume that you know everything, because you don't.
No, it's impossible to know everything. And it's funny, like a thing that I've learned in life. I think I shared this with you last time. It seems the more you learn, the more you realize how little you know, right? Because it's just impossible to learn everything. But yeah, staying humble is key because there's always a new angle, a new thing to learn. And if you don't create that curiosity, then you might as well stop doing everything, right? So
Sure, sure.
yeah, cool, man. So you had some late news recently, a couple weeks ago
Mhm.
that was pretty interesting about some pricing. I'm curious how that whole experience was. Share if you could share what that was, and then like what the experience was, if you don't mind, if that's all right.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you're referencing the steel side of things, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So it's been, I mean, I think hectic is probably the best way to put it. But the last month and a half really have kind of reached a fever pitch and sustained, which I think caught most people in the industry off guard. And what's been happening is basically steel mills have been putting out price increases since the end of November on flat rolled products. And sometimes they've been announcing just a dollar amount increase. Sometimes they've been announcing minimum pricing, especially for hot rolled coil, which is, the base product that goes into value add products and
Mm-hmm.
many things that make up our economy. So, what's happened in the last month and a half, though, is that the pace of these increases has grown, I mean, exponentially quicker. So, whereas before they may wait 2 or 3 weeks between announcements, I mean, we had announcements that were 6 days apart from each other. And that has never happened. Even during COVID, late 2020 into early 2021, when prices were also skyrocketing, or even in the recent times in February, March, and April of 2022, when prices were also shooting up because of the conflict in Europe, we didn't see actual announced price increases be put out that quickly. Prices were increased in the background. And we heard about it because we talked to people about it. Now the steel mills are making a point to put out price increases and at a rapid pace, and that's caught a lot of people in the market off guard,
Right.
and has actually started to create a lot of consternation amongst people who buy steel because they are realizing all of a sudden, like, oh, okay, if we want more steel, we're actually going to be held to these higher prices, but we really don't want to pay these higher prices. It makes us uncompetitive. And they're it's a catch-22. Do you have steel to sell or not? Is it going to be at a high price or you're going to have nothing? And I'm not saying that people don't have anything because what a lot of people are doing right now is they're buying on their contracts. And the reason why that's advantageous is because their contracts have 5 to 9% discounts off of the printed price, which is broadly accepted to be a lagging indicator. And people will argue by how much. I'm not really here to say one way or the other, but if you think of the contract prices having a bit of a lag and that discount on top of it, you could be looking at a price difference between the stated spot price and your contract price of $150 plus a short ton. I mean, it's a huge gap, and so in a way, I think a lot of people are kind of frozen right now. I mean, like they want to act and they could try to, but the other problem is that the lead times at the steel mills, so the time it takes between an order being made and that being ready to be picked up at the steel mill has gone out. I think we're talking about now 7 to 8 weeks roughly on hot rolled. I would give it a 1 to 3 weeks longer on cold rolled and galvanized, the value added products. And that kind of is scary to people because what can happen in 2 months? Well, we've seen what can happen in 2 months. We saw it in April and May of 2022. We saw it through most of last year as well, where prices just cleaved off huge chunks of cost over month after month, week after week. So if you make an order right now, and let's just say you pay Nucor, the largest steel maker in the country and the second or third largest flat rolled steel maker, their HRC minimum price is $11.50 right now. So what if you go out and you buy, let's just say 1,000 tons at 11.50 right now, but it's not going to show up until first week of May. Give it 2 months. Well, that's not showing up. It will be ready to get picked up. Then you have to go pick it up and you have to bring it to your facility. And so you may be looking at 2.5 months. And people are worried that there will be a downward correction in that amount of time.
Yeah.
But we don't know because there's a lot of factors going on right
Yeah. Yeah. And what factors would those be, Rye? Like, are you talking bigger scale, like inflation and these types of things?
now. So, it's interesting because it feels like each year is giving us a different thing to focus on.
Isn't that the truth?
Yeah, 2020 was COVID and manufacturing shutdowns, which led to 2021, which was a lack of steel. In 2022, you had a pullback in buying and a glut of steel, punctuated by raw material shortage fears. That was February through April, which were then quickly negated and led to the oversupply continuing. Now, what's happening in 2023, which is really interesting, because everyone sees smoke, but they think there's one big fire, and it's really a bunch of smoldering little ones. Because going into this year, what people expected was that there was going to be a lot of spot availability. They thought that the steel makers would produce a lot of steel, and you would be able to go out and get whatever steel you wanted at whatever price you wanted. So what did that mean? That meant that these service centers, the people who serve as the middlemen between the steel mills and manufacturers, and I hope they don't get mad at me for saying middlemen, but that is, I mean, they serve that, they sit in that spot. And what they did going into this year, not only did they get bigger contract discounts, but they also reduced broadly the amount of contract they were purchasing. So a lot of them reduced their contract volumes by anywhere from 10 to 30%. Now, that doesn't mean that they made, huge shifts or they're all of a sudden we're all on spot. No, I think the majority of them were still majority contract, but it lessened their exposure to having extra material on site. Okay. Because they'd worked their inventories down a lot. And that is where we sat going into November and December of last year, which is typically the slowest 2 months of the year because of Thanksgiving and Christmas and New Year's. They had cut their inventories down a huge amount. And then at the same time, the steel mills were trying to push prices up end of November into December. And people were like, business isn't that good right now. Everyone's on holiday, right? So we get into January and the steel mills keep pushing prices up. And people were like, okay, well, we expect prices to go up. They expected it to be range bound. I would say roughly, people were telling me anywhere from 600 to 850 is what they expected. I was like, okay, well, I don't know. We'll see. And what happened is that just like the other run-ups that have happened before it, 2020, 2021, and also the brief period of 2022, prices went higher than anyone would have expected them to. And the reason I had that set up just now is because here's some of the reasons why, the trends that are driving this. One is that since mid-October, the steel makers have kept their utilization rates in the US below 75%. Now, this is utilization rates for everything from rebar to beam to flat rolled mills, plate, but broadly speaking, they're low. And on top of that, we had confirmation from Nucor, Steel Dynamics or SDI, and US Steel in their fourth quarter earnings that they did keep their utilization rates rather low in the 70-ish% range, or in the 70s. And for Nucor and SDI, they were the lowest rates in 2 and 2.5 years, respectively. Mm-hmm. For one of them, we're talking about the lowest rate since the second quarter of 2020, when the U.S. economy had shut down and was trying to restart after the COVID-related.
Yeah.
So that has crimped supply. And again, on top of that, you've got really tight inventories on the service center side. Now, add something that no one expected, which is we're at, end of the first week of March, going to the second week. and we don't have a recession.
Hmm.
And the economy is doing a bit better than people thought it would. And while it doesn't mean that things are going gangbusters or anything, it means that demand has remained more steady than expected, which means that people are pulling a little bit more steel than expected from these already depleted inventories. And the replacement from the steel mills is hard to find. And if you want to find it, it's really expensive now.
Hmm.
So that caught a lot of people off guard. On top of that, kind of bolstering this a little bit, is that raw materials remain elevated globally. Iron ore is still pretty elevated. Pig iron is elevated, which is a major feedstock into the U.S. Steelmaking market. Scrap is elevated, and right now we're in probably one of the messiest trades we've seen since I think it was March of last year. Very, very all over the place right now, and that is something that while it's not really comparable because of how high steel prices have risen.
Hmm.
It definitely is one of those background pressures that you know does keep pushing things up. And now you also have lead times. As I said before, the amount of time it takes between ordering and it being ready has gone out. So all of these little things combined, and throw on top of it a horrible dual earthquake in Turkey,
Hmm.
on the face of it, looked like it was going to take out a lot of steel production and consumption because they buy a lot of scrap from the U.S. But what actually happened is they're still taking scrap from the U.S. and now they may need it even more urgently for the rebuilding process because their steel mills were operating at about 50% capacity prior to the earthquakes. So they had steel mills that could produce more. And from what I can tell, it seems like the steel mills that were impacted by the earthquakes may have resumed at least some operations. So people thought that would be, no more scrap going to Turkey for some time, and that turned out not to be accurate either.
Hmm.
And I think what's really, what it really comes down to is, I think a lot of people, when they looked at what the market was going to be doing, at the end of 2022, what they were expecting for 2023, it turned out to just it was wrong. Um, and the thing is I was in the same boat. I mean, I thought that there would be a lot of steel capacity online. But we've got, some mills that seem to continue to struggle from my conversations with people, including Nucor Gallatin in Kentucky,
Yeah.
um, and SDI Sinton in Texas. There are two mills that have either expanded in Kentucky or are brand new in Texas, and they've continued to have some issues. And I mean, the companies have admitted as such too.
Yeah. And what kind of issues? Like, is it operational issues? Um, I don't know if you can talk about that, but I'm just curious.
Right. So
What
it's what we
is it?
know is what they've said publicly.
Yeah.
So on the
Is it? I feel like it's maybe it's a not enough people issue because that is an issue everywhere.
so that is an issue everywhere, but and that was an issue at one point, at least in Texas. So in just to focus on SDI in Texas, they've had um, they've had issues going on for some time now, but they've been different ones, kind of period by period, quarter by quarter.
Yeah.
When they were building it, they had a lot of rain, and they had a lot of weather, and it caused issues with construction. Labor was a big issue as well. Right now, what the issue is, at least what was said by the CEO, was it was something to do with equipment availability with regards to the rolling operations.
Oh,
And so what that mostly is like when you have these rollers, you need to replace them because they undergo huge amounts of stress and
of
wear.
course.
And so what it seems like is the supply chain, which like kind of a reminder, COVID's not over and there are still supply chain issues, but the supply chain is tight. And so what they said is they expected those issues to be worked out by the end of the first quarter of this year. So that would be the end of March. Um, I don't mean to be a pessimist, but I will believe it when I
Yeah.
see it. And the thing is that it's really interesting. You've got this ultra modern mill. I had a bunch of sources who were out at the open house there last week. They're like, it's a beast. They're like, it's a really modern mill. It's got all the new tech and everything. But it's one of those things where it has kind of been beset by issues through its entire startup, which began. I'm having to remember. I'm pretty sure it was early last year is when they began really starting it up. And new mill starts are hard. I mean,
Oh yeah.
I'm not gonna lie. I mean, it is hard. What they're doing is hard.
Hmm.
It's just one of those things that the expectations have been that it would have gotten started up quicker and better. At the same time, it's one of those things where the market was under pressure most of last year, and adding 3 million tons a year of production capacity.
Yeah. 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 Well,
That doesn't.
even getting down to the human level of like the people in the operations and the CEO, you like they're expected to say things that,
Mhm.
and they have to be positive, right? Because, they want to get to a certain place by a certain time, and having a good mindset towards that
Yeah.
helps.
Yeah. I
So,
mean, the fact that they got a mill built during COVID is in itself remarkable. I mean, that's, hats off to them for continuing with a massive project. And then, when you look at Nucor up in Kentucky with their Gallatin mill, that's an even more fascinating story, because that was a mill that had a production capacity of 1.6 million tons a year, and they almost doubled it to 3 million.
wow.
And what's really interesting, because I wasn't working at Argus when this first was proposed, but it took basically 5 years between two CEOs for this modernization upgrade of this mill to get completed, which in of itself is a remarkable time frame. But they basically, and I mean, Leon Topalian, CEO at Nucor, he said this too, I believe, on the most recent earnings calls, or maybe two earnings calls ago, where he admitted, he's like, look, like we can't treat Nucor Gallatin as just an expansion. He's like, we essentially modernized the entire mill. And that's hard, because it's one thing to go take a piece of land and build a new mill there, because you can do whatever you want. But when you're having to take an existing mill and then add on to it,
Mm.
you're dealing with all the constraints of equipment that may be 10, 20. I mean, geez, we've got some mills in this country that have been on site for over 100 years. Now, not the Nucors of the world, talking others, but
Yeah.
it can get tricky. So they've definitely continued to struggle. Mr. Topalian himself said that they were running 6 months behind what they expected, and that's difficult. And it's one of those things where I don't know when that's going to get worked out.
Hmm. Hmm.
I mean, that is obviously, like, people keep saying, like, well, that's the goal, right? Like, they want to produce. I'm like, it is the goal. That's why you have a facility. That's why you put all this money into it.
That's right.
So
Yeah.
at some point, they will get their stuff figured out. And I presume it would be this year, but, I kind of thought that last year as well. So,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's fair. I mean, and that makes sense. Supply and demand economics
Mhm.
101, right? It's going to say that the pricing goes up and the supply is down. I just wonder, I'm surprised that nobody's filling in the voids from other producers, right?
Well, so here's actually one thing that I missed in my list, because the list has gotten longer over the last couple of weeks. But one of the sources to fill the void typically is imports, and imports in the last 6 months of 2022 plunged, especially on the flat side. So you saw hot rolled and hot dip galvanized or coated steel products really fall off in like big ways. And a lot of that was because, with prices falling as quickly as they did in the US, it created huge risk for importing, when some of those imports can take 3 to 6 months to get in.
Hmm.
So people basically cut the spigot off. And on top of that, global prices remained relatively elevated compared to the US. I believe at a certain point, the US was trading at a discount. And there were talks of whether or not, we would export steel, which
Mhm.
is always a great, great conversation to have with people, because that really means things are not doing too well. But so with that said, I mean, I just wrote a story about how February is looking like it's going to be the ninth consecutive month of declining, like year over year declining imports. And, the earliest that could turn around would be July, August, because right now that's what the lead times are for that. And I'm
Yeah.
talking about not Canada, Mexico.
No,
Um,
no, I know what you're saying. Yeah.
but that is tricky because global prices are also elevated, and it's we have risen really quickly. But again, it raises the question of where is the market going to be at that point in
Hmm.
July and August. Now, I've talked to some people. I had a service center tell me that they had purchased a slug of imports, just under 3,000 tons. And I was like, why? And they're like, the customer wanted it. It was at a good price for them. And so we went for it for July. I'm like, okay. And then I talked to a trader who was also talking about how they're, going to be bringing in steel as well. And, it's one of those things where
Yeah.
people who know how to use the futures and hedge and everything are able to maybe take more advantage of some of these situations than others. On top of that, speaking of Mexico and Canada, Mexico has had its own issues because AMSA, one of the major steelmakers there, spent a lot of the last 3 months mostly shut down because of non-payment issues to the Mexican government. There have been some moves recently that may revive its steelmaking operations, but there's a lot of questions about how quickly they could restart
Okay.
and to what production levels, because they're already operating at lower levels.
Hmm.
Ternium, who's one of the major steelmakers in Mexico, the other steelmakers down there have had to fill the gap and fill the void. Get kind of mixed signals as to how much that has impacted the amount of steel coming out of Mexico into the US. But if you just look at the raw numbers, I mean, they're down. It's the same for Canada into the US, but some of that may also be fear. So
Mm.
Canada and Mexico have a special deal with the US government regarding Section 232, 25% steel tariffs, where neither of them have to pay the tariffs and there's no quota, but there's an understanding that you keep your volumes to a certain level of how much steel you're sending across the border. And a group of senators a couple of weeks ago sent a letter to the Biden administration saying that Mexico had violated the spirit of that agreement.
Mm.
And that may be creating a little bit of fear north of the border as well to not want to be
Yes.
caught up in that. So
Yeah.
that's one of the other moving parts.
Yeah. Fair enough. And that makes sense. Besides the, issues in producing steel and metals in production and operations, do you think there's any fear, like you'd said, around producing and going to 100% capacity based on the times we're in?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's really odd is that, I mean, the Trump administration with the Section 232 tariffs they initially said that they wanted to get the steel industry to 80% plus utilization rates because that's the profitable range. They later amended that to 83 or 85%, which I thought was funny. They did that without telling anyone. We found it in documents.
Hmm.
And that was convenient because the steel industry had gotten to 80% and the 232 tariffs were still there. So they kind of had to up the number. But that 80% threshold is seen as the kind of profitable range you want to be in, especially when you're talking about the traditional blast furnace integrated mills, because those mills want to run 24/7. It's the nature of their operations
Mhm.
and their efficiencies. Now, they only make up 30% or less of the overall steel industry in the US now.
Mhm.
Uh, and the thing is that, with the price being elevated and the low point being higher than previous low points, it kind of begs the question of like, okay, like, do you have to run as much as before? I mean, I'm not saying anything that's revolutionary or anything that's
No, no, but
whatever. It's when you're making more money per ton, then if all of a
exactly.
sudden you make double, you don't have to produce double.
That's right.
So that's kind of the thing that seems to be going on right now is they're content with operating at lower production rates. We've seen this especially plainly throughout this entire market, in the plate market, where plate prices have remained very high. I mean, $1,480 a short ton for plate for a couple months now on the X Works side. I mean, Nucor's plate mills operated at like much lower than what they would normally operate at for their plate mills. So, and they could still make.
Yeah. I have a hunch that they realized that they could do this through COVID, and they stuck with it. That's my hunch, but you don't have to comment on that.
Well, here's the thing though. So what happened with COVID was it will probably never happen again. I mean, it may, but it probably will never happen again because they all shut down. I mean, we saw tens of millions of tons of steelmaking capacity just taken offline overnight. And when they had to go and try to bring them back on, it's kind of like if you shut down an entire power grid, which we nearly had here in Texas 2 years ago. If that had happened here in Texas, and I remember this from covering it as a utility reporter, you would have to restart nodes of power. So you would have to like start up power plants, like the power plants in San Antonio, and then the power plants out between San Antonio and Houston. You'd have to start little power nodes, and then the power would have to kind of like trickle out, and then in order to restore the grid, and no one would really know how well it would work. And what happened with the steel industry is unlike a manufacturing line where you can like turn the machines off, and you come back the next day and turn all the power back on, and everything is still there. You've got to like make sure that everything is working well, because the thing that happens when you don't is things can blow up.
Yeah. Okay.
And so that was kind of the slowness of the steel industry getting back on its feet in 2020 was a lot of that. And then in 2021, what really happened is they broadly were still dealing with a lot of operational issues, and they overbooked for like a while because of those operational issues. And then in 2022, end of 2021, they caught up. So like people were telling me they got 3 months worth of steel in 2 months or a month and a half.
Yeah.
Then everyone on the service center side were like, put the purchase order books away, put your feet on the table, but actually don't, because you need to get the steel out. And they spent a lot of 2022 reducing their inventories that had all of a sudden overbuilt, and the steel mills kept producing. That was actually like the big thing for them is they kept producing and were at elevated utilization rates, and they did come down, but it took a while for them to get them down. As I said, since mid-October, they've been below 75%, which sounds lower, but it's actually not low compared to where we were at the beginning of COVID in the 50s. But that sustained reduction combined with the lower inventories have finally, and then you throw in all these little sprinkles of additional things have combined to where we are right now.
Yeah. Interesting. So the buyers, are you in talks with them a lot too? And I just wanted to kind of talk about some of that. So that you've got automotive, like these major parts of our economy. You've got automotive, right? What else do you have? You've got automotive. You've got what else?
You know, construction is actually the largest consumer of steel products.
So like bridges and roads and infrastructure.
And buildings, like all the, I don't know why I motioned, but like I'm pointing to a huge condo building across from me. There's one being built just down the road. The building I'm in right now. But yeah, I mean, construction touches so much of the industry, and especially when it comes to the hot rolled side of things, because so much of what goes into buildings or roads and everything, it gets buried. You don't have to see it, so you don't care about the surface quality. And so, you know, what one thing that I can say for sure is residential things that touch residential right now doing pretty bad.
Fair enough.
Because interest rates have really killed that. So you think your refrigerators, you think your other appliances, or HVAC even, not doing so great. Where has been actually quite interestingly resilient is the non-residential construction. So apartment buildings, condos, some commercial space, not offices, for all the obvious reasons.
Yeah.
But a lot of other stuff. I mean, housing is still a huge problem in the United States. So if people can't buy houses because they either can't afford it or there's not enough, they need to live somewhere. And so
Yeah.
apartments, condos are continuing to fill that void.
Hmm.
And so that part of the industry has remained relatively strong. It usually is on about a 6 to 12 month lag to big economic moves. So if a recession starts, you would usually see that in construction about 6 to 12 months later, because
Hmm.
all the projects that have already been started are going to be finished.
Okay.
Then that lag is that new projects aren't being started. And what people have been telling me why there's been some resiliency in the non-residential side is because, actually going back to a point you made earlier about SDI and their Texas mill, is labor. So labor for construction is still very tight,
Mm.
and that has delayed projects that haven't been canceled. So I'm hearing about a lot of delays still,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
I haven't heard cancellations, and that has also been reflected in the comments made by at least some of the steel makers as well.
Okay. Very good. Thank you for that information. I was talking to Josh about this kind of, and I'm curious your take on it. The infrastructure bill.
Mhm.
Like, are you seeing a lot of any spending on that? Like, what's your whole take on the whole infrastructure bill, and in the metals markets?
So it is coming, not yet. And the thing is like we've seen some big projects be let. So the money being put out there of how much is going to be spent on it, and people, bidding on that. But broadly speaking, a lot of that is still working through the process, I guess.
Yeah.
And so most people expect that we'll start seeing a lot more of it end of this year, going into next year. And I mean, it's going to be, I think, a somewhat maybe midterm sustained consumption point, because it like some of these projects are going to take years to
Yeah,
complete.
fair enough.
And it's gonna probably be more impactful on the plate side. You think bridges, they need thicker material, longer lasting material.
Mhm.
And so the plate side, and also long products, so rebar, because it'll be going into concrete roads and all that stuff.
Mhm.
There'll probably be some flat demand. I like to say that flat steel will probably be impacted because it goes into all the stuff that supports these things. But yeah, I mean, we definitely should expect there to be some sort of impact going into the future. And I mean, there's this like trio of bills. They all touch different things. On the renewable side, solar is not going anywhere, and that sort of like hot rolled galvanized product for those, because like no one's going to see this, is going to sit in the field forever, but you don't want it to corrode.
Yep.
So that sort of stuff will continue to be in demand. On the wind turbine side, that's going to be really interesting, because the onshore and offshore wind industries continue to develop. I would say onshore is probably, well, it is more mature, but I wouldn't say it is mature. And the offshore is very new, but that's going to require a lot of plate products as well. And right now, a lot of the turbine monopiles, or the big tubular portions of it,
Mhm.
a lot of those are manufactured in Asia or Europe right now and shipped over to us.
Okay.
But we've got at least one manufacturer on the East Coast who's working on their own facility. Looks like they just proved out their first offshore monopile, and did inspections on it in the last week or two. We'll see if there's other people who jump into it. Nucor's new Brandenburg, Kentucky plate mill, which is still going through its commissioning phases, was built specifically to target the offshore wind industry, among other plate related industries. So I expect there to be more demand from that as well.
Yeah.
It's unlikely though to offset, say, oil and gas demand. It's one of those things where the oil and gas industry consumes ridiculous amounts of steel, that go downhole and
Hmm.
transport it. So yeah.
Yeah. I'm curious your perspective on, you know, getting a new generation of this is a problem that we're all going to face in the industry of, you know, attracting new talent, attracting interest, making it sexy, making it innovative. You know, I'm curious your thoughts on, you know, if what how we can do that. Are there things that aren't happening that could be happening in the industry to attract new talent of the generation Z or whatever?
Right. Um, yeah, I've heard a lot of complaints about this over the years because, in my prior life as a newspaper reporter, I covered manufacturing. And I mean, this is, as you know, as anyone should know, it
Hmm.
is a big problem, and it's only
Yeah.
gotten worse. A lot of reporting lately that I've been hearing about the labor issues talks about how many a couple million people basically took early retirements, and
Yeah.
they left the workforce that way, and they've been out for 3 years now.
Hmm.
And that was something I think a lot of people didn't expect. On top of that, you've got the tragedy that is COVID, with the deaths and the long COVID that have pushed a lot of people out of the labor force, in those multiple ways.
And,
And
and the boomers are coming. I mean, are retiring now.
right,
And
right. Again, exacerbating the problem of
yeah.
this large amount of the workforce that is at retirement age or about to be. Um, and I think the thing that a lot of people need to recognize is that they need to invest in their business. Um, and I talk to a lot of service centers, who I talk to are the ones who have the biggest issues. But I think steel mills have the same problems. I think traders have the same problems. But you really got to invest in your business and your people. If you've got a welding shop and it's entirely exposed to at least the temperature parts of the elements, the hot and cold, maybe you need to create a climate controlled warehouse where people can work in that's also like safe air wise, so
Hmm.
everything's pulled out and filtered. I think that sort of comfort level, maybe some people see it as being excessive, but at the same time it's like, well, look, like, it's just like, if you don't have material to sell, you don't have a business. If you don't have someone to put that stuff together, you really don't have a business.
Well, and I was just gonna say, some of the listeners would be like, "Oh, for Christ's sakes, that's bullshit. I would never do that." But we're at a point where you don't have an option. You need the people to
Right.
run your business, like you just said, and you've got to do what you got to do to make it happen.
Well, and also another portion of this is paying people a fair wage for the work that they do, and acknowledging the fact that inflation is a huge problem, and that maybe you need to do something like offering a 401k match or better health insurance.
Mhm.
Um, at the same time, I'm not going to gloss over this. I have plenty of sources who told me, like, we have raised wages 4 times and like X amount of percent, and like it's so hard to hold on to people. There are some real structural problems with the workforce for sure.
Mhm.
I don't generally like to uh, blame the workers for this. I think also, business owners need to talk to their workers about what's not working. Like,
I think that is, yeah, it's both parties, right? And I mean, I've been on both sides, and communication, taking the risk of giving somebody authorship is important, but it's
mhm,
also important for the worker to communicate with their management or boss to say,
right,
"This is what I don't like."
right.
People can't read minds, right?
Yeah, and I do think there is a bit of a generational issue with that. And I was at a conference a couple of weeks ago, and there was a gentleman there who was speaking about the generational differences and how the different generations communicate. And that was really interesting because it wasn't like I didn't know that stuff, but to hear him kind of put it out there in the more practical examples of, like, the older generation, like, expects you to, like, email them about it or something, and the younger generation is like, no, just like talk to me, like let's talk, like let's do this, like. And I think there were ways where like I think people didn't expect that to be the thing, but like
Hmm.
you know, you've got to meet people where their communication style is. I'm not saying be disrespected or something. If someone is not a good worker, then like you need to
Well,
deal with that. But at the same time, like, sometimes you need to acknowledge that the way that you're handling it isn't the best way. And that does go both ways. Absolutely. I mean,
yeah,
there are times where you've got to like take a step back as a worker and say, like, maybe that wasn't the best way to put that. Maybe that wasn't the right moment. Um, but yeah, I mean, that's part of also investing in your people, right?
yeah, yeah.
So,
Showing them that you care.
yeah. At the same time, I've talked to someone who, like, he said they hired 300 people in 1 year. I think it was 2021, and two of them stayed.
Oh dear, that's awful.
So, and yeah, I mean, it's just the thing is like manufacturing is hard work. Broadly speaking, a part of it is going to be hard, and I think that's another thing. We can focus on the labor thing all we want, but part of investing in your operations is automation.
And that's what's a necessity at this point, right? Just
Yeah.
because there isn't enough bodies. So why not put into place automation technology that can further that labor force? And
Right.
then people can add value to the organization instead of doing repetitive tasks. That's my philosophy. I don't know.
And it's also more efficient. I mean,
Yeah.
I think I may have mentioned this to you before, but I watched this video of I-beams being made, and a robot did all of the I-beam work
Oh,
for
I know. I saw that.
yeah,
Amazing.
it was insane. Four I-beams in like 6 hours, and then for four of them to be made by people on two different shifts doing two different things was like
Yeah.
basically 18.
Yeah, it's nuts.
So
Yeah.
you can't. I think the thing that sometimes disappoints me is that people just don't even consider that because they're like, it's not the way that we've done it. And I'm like,
Oh my gosh, isn't that the I was just talking to somebody yesterday about that. He says, I'm having a challenge. My biggest challenge is people saying exactly that. This is the way we've always done it. So what's wrong with this? Well, that's not always the best, right? So, cool, man. Thank you for the perspective on that. The deglobalization and reshoring and this sort of stuff, I mean, that exacerbates the problem even further with the labor shortage. But is that something that's happening that you see because of what's happened through COVID, where our supply chain got disrupted and stuff? And do you think that that's going to be a factor in the metals industry going and steel industry going forward, is thinking more locally?
I mean, I think yes, because we're still having those impacts. I mean, we took a really well-oiled machine of the global economy and broke it
Yeah,
overnight,
yeah,
and it took centuries of mostly uninhibited growth for that to allow to be made. And I think we've restored most of it. And I think like if we just let it be for a couple more years, it'd probably be mostly okay. But I do think that it scared many businesses into bringing what they can back home. Um, I think again though it also comes down partially to the consumer being okay with paying more money because stuff built in the U.S. is probably going to be more expensive overall.
of course. Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I mean I think you're seeing this on the semiconductor side. You're again, as I said, with the wind turbines, people are trying to figure out making it here. Um, I do think you're going to see more of that coming here, but there is also going to be a large chunk of business that's already sunk a lot of time, money, and effort.
Fair
And
enough.
these global supply chains who, you know, probably look at it and say, it's not worth it for us to try it right now.
Yeah.
So I think you're going to see some, but don't expect everything to come
Fair
back to
enough.
the US. So,
Okay.
yeah.
Good. Good. Argus Media, tell me, I don't know exactly. I mean, I kind of have an idea what you do, but I mean, pricing, you
Mhm.
report the news, but like, what's the initiative, um, and mandate Argus? What are you guys
Yeah.
doing?
I mean, illuminating the markets is kind of our phrase, and really, It's about accurate and timely pricing and news, and we really um, it's we're really big around the world, but most people in the metal space wouldn't have heard of us because a lot of our business is oil and gas based. It's one of the reasons why I'm sitting in the Houston office. But we do cover the supply chain on the metal side, from iron ore and pig iron all the way to finished steel all around the world. So I think a lot of people are like, "Oh, Rye, he's in the U.S. and he covers whatever flat steel." I'm like, "Yeah, but I also can tell you what's going on in Europe and Turkey and North Africa and what's happening in Asia and China and all these different countries, because we have colleagues all over the world."
Yeah,
And so, yeah, I mean, for us, pricing is the bread and butter of what we do. It's kind of weird to say because I used to be at newspapers, which struggled to get subscribers. But we at Argus are a subscriber based business. People paying us for pricing is what pays my bills.
hmm
But we also strive to do the news better than anyone else, because you need the context to do good pricing. You cannot do good pricing without
of course.
having the context behind it. So
Yeah.
that's one of the reasons why we produce as much as we do, and as
Yeah.
accurate as we do.
Cool. Well, and it takes energy and resources to provide that information, right?
Yep,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, I mean, I think I I was going to say grew up, but in a way, professionally, I grew up in an industry that struggled to get away from the free model. Newspapers kind of put themselves out there by putting out free news and stuff,
Right.
and tried to claw it back. And it was very hard to do that. And for us, people see the value in what we do because they know who we are, and they know that our numbers are better than anyone else's, and so that's why they pay us. But yeah, I mean, we've got over almost 1,300 people globally in this company,
Oh,
and
wow.
it takes a lot of money to pay people. So,
Yeah, it does, man. Yeah, it does. All right, Rye. Well, thank you so much.
yeah.
It's been awesome. And do you have any parting words or advice for anything, about your career or people looking to be a journalist or about the industry?
Um. Oh, well, that's a good question. I would say, as far as what I do right now in the steel industry, anyone who's in that really needs to realize that uncertainty and change is the only constant going into the future. And I mean forever. That's just not going to change. It's not going to go away.
hmm
Um, and they need to get used to that, because a lot of people still aren't. When it comes to the industry that I work in and being a journalist and stuff, I mean, I think being honest with yourself and those around you with what you know and what you don't know is the most important thing. There's too many people in our industry, and I'm not saying here at Argus, but just journalism at large, who have to they have to fill in the gaps, or they feel like they have to fill in the gaps with knowledge they think they know,
Uh-huh.
assumptions they make, and that's I think that leads to that can be problematic.
Yeah, yeah, fair enough.
So
Definitely something I've noticed in people is, especially in probably the past 5 years, is it doesn't matter the quality of what you're saying as long as you're saying it first. And I noticed that in the news all the way down to colleagues. And it's like, well, that doesn't matter. In my opinion, it doesn't anyway. So,
yeah, and that's the thing here is we always want to be first in our news, but most of all we want to be accurate.
accurate and first. Yeah. All right, right. Thank you so much, man.
Yep. Thanks so much, Greg. Appreciate it.
Yeah. All right. We'll talk to you soon. All right. Okay. Bye.
Greg Sheldon here, your host of Metal, Steel, Manufacturing, and Business Pro podcast, where you learn everything about the metals and manufacturing industry that make your modern day life possible.